Ready? Okay, let's go on the record for a second. Mr. Moran, you should have, I believe you were given copies of those two exhibits we had a discussion about yesterday. Are you still objecting to their admission or not?
I have been given copies, reviewed them. The problem that we're running into is that it looks like the data may not be available that was used to create those exhibits. So Mr. Heidel and I have been discussing it this morning. My understanding is that the longitude and latitudinal points that were used to create that demonstrative aid or map were taken from interviews, going up to the scene with folks, Investigator Patterson's drawing that Your Honor may remember, I believe, been introduced into evidence. And the evidence logs. And my hope was really that it was just taken from the evidence logs, because most of what's in the Colorado County Sheriff's Office evidence logs includes the long lat, as they were referred to yesterday, of items that were taken into evidence. But it sounds like there's other data that was used to create that demonstrative, and lest this become much ado about nothing, what we would like to do, what's been provided to the jury, or what the prosecution started to provide to the jury yesterday, a video of this thing created in Google Earth, rather than the Google Earth, I'm not even sure what to call it, but what would have been necessary to create that image would have been points on the map. So that data is apparently not in one place. And so our ability to recreate it and double check it and add things that we believe need to be included on that map or a similar map to make the picture clear and the record complete is maybe a problem. And my intention would be in cross-examination to speak with Investigator Heidel about what are the longitudinal, latitudinal points that created this map, but it sounds like that may not be something he can answer today. And I hate to waste the jury's time having Investigator Heidel read off the long lat on 10 different items, each of those long lat numbers being, I don't know, 15, 16 characters long. That doesn't seem like a great use of time, but it is information that we think we need so that we can meet that evidence, and review it, and challenge it where necessary. So our record on this needs to be tied to the confrontation clause under the U.S. Constitution and Colorado Constitution.
Mr. Champagne.
Thank you, Judge. This is really a very simple issue. The longitude and latitude for the items that are in the map are contained in the evidence log for those items where it was recorded. There are probably 3, perhaps 4 items where the longitude and latitude was not recorded in the evidence log, and those are instead contained in a hand-drawn map that's already been admitted. Investigator Heidel used the GPS locations in discovery, both in reports, in the evidence log, that have been turned over to defense counsel for years to build a map. For those items that didn't have a GPS location, he consulted the hand-drawn map from Investigator Patterson. After that map was created, Investigator Heidel and Investigator Izell went up to Middle Mountain, confirmed the locations of each one of the GPS items where GPS had been recorded to the best of their capacity and Investigator Izell's memory and observations at the time those things were recorded. So the map was then confirmed by Investigator Izell in that process. The map was then presented to the investigators who actually collected the items, including Investigator Galbraith, Investigator Patterson, and Investigator Gabbard. They all confirmed that those locations were accurate and the map was a fair and accurate reflection of where the items were collected. That's how the map was created. The GPS items are contained in a concise way in the evidence log. And so it's unclear to me what defense counsel is referring to when he says that the data is not available any longer, or that there were interviews that took place that he's not privy to. None of that is accurate. Just as we discussed yesterday, this is akin to a recording that is authenticated outside the courtroom by a witness who listens to it, confirms it's accurate, signs the disc confirming it was accurate, then that is played for the jury in the courtroom and presented and admitted as an exhibit. This is really not that complicated. I'm not sure why we're running into these challenges.
All right. I don't see this being any different than a compilation exhibit. The underlying data is available. It doesn't have to be in one place. It doesn't have to be readily available. It just has to be available. I know this is a huge case. I think it's a problem for both sides with all the information that's been gathered, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast. I'm overruling the objection stated today about the one exhibit. I assume both exhibits, because I understand from our conference of the bench there were two of them. The reason I continued that portion of Mr. Heidel's testimony was because not because of that so much as the fact that the exhibit that was tendered was slightly different than what was provided to defense counsel. It was a total of 25 yards in terms of radius of the circle that's drawn. Based upon the scale of what's going on, I don't see that to be a big deal, but I thought they should have the opportunity to look at it. And I don't know if this hit the record, but I know I heard it, and I believe defense counsel heard it yesterday, that it was just double-checked, and that's why the difference between the two diagrams. Is that correct, Mr. Shankman?
Yes, Judge, and if I could speak briefly on the topic. It turned out that the exhibit that had been tendered to defense counsel was actually the correct exhibit. Okay. Okay. So this, talk about much ado now about nothing. I had failed to update my printed copy. When we went back down and double-checked the work, what we found is that the correct one had been given to defense counsel, and it does have the expanded range, which I think, from defense counsel's perspective, and I don't mean to put words in their mouth, I think actually serves their interests and arguments better than the tightened range that was the incorrect one. So I think we're good on that. Unless there was other objection to Exhibit 489 from defense counsel, and I can only speculate, so I don't know. But that was something I wanted to clarify. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
I guess the only other thing I want to talk about is this weekend, I hope, or I will, go through the instructions given to me by both sides. I'll get you guys a preliminary thought as to what my idea is on instructions, so that you'll know if there's something you think I'm missing or is wrong. Give you some time to do that, so it's not all last second. And I know things will change when there's more evidence, so, but just the preliminary version of those. And I also want the parties to start thinking. You don't have to tell me now, I think it's too early, but just for planning purposes, I'd like to know sometime next week how long both sides want to present.
Great, thank you, Judge.
With that, I think we're ready for the jury. Are they in?
Oh, sorry, Your Honor.
Yeah.
We were going to call Drayton Harrison as our first witness and then recall Chuck Heidel, if that serves the court.
Fine. That's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Once you have the jury, come on. Thank you. Well, in terms of what's in, it'll be. That one? Okay, because this is the one that's. Can I, Mr. Champagne? No? So is this one going to the jury? No, this is one going to the jury. Oh, as the incorrect one. That was our question. So this was 10. This was what, yeah, I guess we need to keep it, so, okay, as being the one tendered yesterday. Okay. It's up here whenever you're ready for it.
Tell me. I'm going to ask to have that published.
Thank you. Okay, great. We need to remember also, Phil McCall likes to practice with those on Friday then too. We got the cordless with the Belmonts. We'd play those on Friday afternoon. No. Maybe rise for the jury. All right, we can be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to let you know that we do appear to be back on schedule, so we don't have to worry yet about going longer than we anticipated. I think we'll be fine. Also for tomorrow, we've all talked. We will quit around noon, depending on how the witnesses fall, maybe just a touch later. But I wanted to let you know that in case you have plans for the court. So, Mr. Johnson, your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The people called Drayton Harrison.
And if you'd raise your hand before you sit down, right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you. Have a seat. No, he's good. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please start by introducing yourself to the jury by your full name?
My name is Drayton Patrick Harrison.
And could you spell your last name for the court recorder, please?
Harrison.
Mr. Harrison, are you recently retired?
I've been retired about 4 years.
And what did you do for work prior to your retirement?
I was a district wildlife manager for 26 years for the, at the time, Colorado Division Wildlife, and then they merged and became Colorado Parks and.
Generally speaking, what is the Colorado Parks and Wildlife?
Well, my job, I mean, they're charged with managing all the species of wildlife within the state of Colorado.
And what was your job specifically with Colorado Parks and Wildlife?
As a district wildlife manager, we were assigned a geographical area. I'm kind of the frontline person regarding anything involving wildlife, the management. We were level and peace officers, so we enforce wildlife laws, education, like I said, anything to do with wildlife.
So you regulate hunting and poaching and things like that?
Correct.
Does this involve a lot of time out in the field?
It's pretty much 95% field work.
Okay. Meaning you're out in the mountains, out in the woods?
Correct, yeah. They give a geographical area. Mine was, I was based in Durango, worked in Silverton, all the way to the top of Red Mountain Pass, parts of the Wilderness Wilderness, so maybe 1,500 square miles.
Okay. And did that overlap at times with the Vallecito area?
Yes, there was an officer based out of Bayfield for a long time, and so I called my neighboring officer. We worked together at times in each other's districts. His was Vicito. And when the days off, I would go to Vicito and cover his area. Or if I was on call, they're always on call 4 or 5 days a month. If I got some on call and was required to go over there, I'd go over there. Well, I spent time over there on my days off too.
And what kind of things did you do up there on your days off?
There's several trailheads up there. You can go up there and hike in some neat places, hunt it up there, just drive around and enjoy the view.
Okay. Do you also have a bachelor's degree?
I do have a bachelor's degree in biology.
Okay. And then you talked about some of your duties as regional wildlife manager. Were there also a specific duty that involved examining kill sites?
Yeah, so part of it said it involved anything to do with wildlife. So in Colorado, they have the state's liable for any loss of livestock by being killed by predators. So if somebody had lost livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, whatever, and they thought a predator was involved, we'd be called in to investigate. And we also manage, complaints with bears, lions, coyotes. So, yeah, we're the point person. So within that district, if something came up and there was a phone call, it landed in my lap.
Okay. And in examining those kill sites, was part of your job to determine what the animal was that did the kill?
Correct.
Why?
Well, if certain animals, like if a lion or bear killed something like livestock, the state was required to reimburse that person for the value. And so, if you're a rancher or, a hobby farmer, if you lose something that costs you a lot of money, they would like to get reimbursed. Plus, the animal is going to keep coming back and keep coming back. And so our job also was to stop the attacks. So whether it was trapping the animal and relocating it or just destroying the animal, if that's what was required.
And in doing this work, how many kill sites of animals would you say over 26 years that you examined to determine what animal did it?
Several hundred would be conservative estimate.
Okay. Are you familiar specifically with Middle Mountain Road as well?
Yes, I've been numerous times.
About how many times? Just rough ballpark.
50.
So when you talk about recreating in Vallecito and working sometimes in Vallecito, that includes Middle Mountain Road?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And at this time, I'd move to qualify Mr. Harrison as an expert in wildlife behavior.
I think his qualifications are a little more narrow than that, Judge. I'd stipulate the kill site investigation and animal management, but not behavior.
You okay with that?
Yes, and I would assume that includes the dispersal of those remains. If so, I agree totally.
And it would.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So you'll be so qualified. Thank you.
So, Mr. Harrison, the jury heard from Dr. Johnson already, so I don't want to cover all the same things, but your experience is very different than hers, fair to say?
Heather, and we were coworkers for many years. Heather was a researcher, so researchers, they have one specific task or topic, and they spend years studying that. And so, hers, we had different tasks. Yeah, we worked together if we could help each other, but she had her job and I had mine.
Is it within your area to inform this jury about what an animal does to disperse of remains, for example?
I've experienced that lots of times. Sure.
Great, let's talk about that. So I want to talk about bears. Bears are one of the animals that have done some of the livestock killings that you've investigated. What does a bear killing typically look like if a bear kills livestock?
So bears are, strong, powerful animals. They're more of a mauler. So they'll rush in, grab whether it's a deer, elk calf, lamb, goat, alpaca. They're not picky. Very powerful animals. They'll grab them. They'll bite. Very powerful jaws. They bite the upper back, the neck. During the struggle, they'll be biting on the head, sometimes the face, and then sometimes they pummel the animal with their front paws. So there's bruising involved.
Is it fair to say if a bear kills livestock that there's going to be kind of a bloody scene that you're going to see?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. There's ground disturbance, paw prints, chunks of hair, blood, and then, you know, if they're successful, then there's a dead carcass that we examine. Okay. And then that's the next step to determine what really killed the animal. Okay.
And do they typically target those smaller animals when they can?
I've seen them take on 500, 600, 700-pound cows. So, yeah, no, it doesn't have to be small.
Okay, interesting. And then when they do, is the site of where the attack happened something that's typically visible because of the attack that you described?
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence to look at. I mean, they leave you lots of stuff to study.
Let's talk about what they do after a kill of livestock. How do they typically feed or move remains?
So bears, you know, sometimes they'll just start to feed, or they might take that animal, you know, if it's small enough, they'll move it into some brush or some trees where they feel safe and secure, and they'll start feeding on that animal. So bears in particular, if that animal is lactating, like if it's a lamb, or it could be a doe deer or a cow elk, lactating, that's the first thing they feed on is the udder. And then after that, they're kind of haphazard. They'll just feed on anything. But they kind of peel the hide off. It's interesting. They just, with their paws, they push and roll the hide back. And so it's kind of interesting. If they've been feeding on something for a day or two or three, you can just see his hide kind of rolled up and pushed off to the side. So.
And you talked about them feeding directly at the kill site at times. At times, do they move animals any type of distance?
I've never seen that. They'll sit on that animal, that carcass, consume it. It might, depending on the size of it, might take them a couple days, but they'll feed on it and then you know, walk a short distance, rest, come back and feed on it until there's nothing left to consume, and then they'll leave it for the other scavengers to pick over what's left.
So bears typically, how far at most have you seen that they'll actually move remains?
You know, I've never seen them go a bear 50 or 100 yards. Just they didn't need to go far.
Let's talk about mountain lions, or should I call them cougars? Is it the same thing?
They go by cougars, mountain lions, pumas.
Okay.
It's all the same animal.
All right. Have you examined kill sites from them on livestock and cattle as well?
Numerous.
And what is that also a bloody type of scene, something that you can recognize where it occurs?
Yeah, mountain lions are, so they're different than bears. They're, I'm sure if you have a house cat, sometimes you might see it stalking. So mountain lion is a much larger version of stalking an animal within, you know, they rely on stealth. So try and get 20, 30 feet from an animal, and then the last 30 feet is just an ambush. They're very, you know, average mountain lion is probably 150 pounds. A large male is probably 180 to 190. That's a large animal. They'll jump on an animal's back. A mule deer are their number one prey, mule deer and elk. But they'll get on their back, and they have very large claws. Sink the claws in, and they're biting the back of the neck. They're trying to break the neck is what they're trying to do to that animal. But again, I've seen, you know, in the it's a struggle for survival, right? Fight for life. So there'll be teeth marks on the top of the head, maybe once in a while on the face. But they're very efficient at killing their prey.
So if that were to happen at a particular site, given the way that they attack, you'd probably see blood, etc.
Sure, there's plenty of disturbance and clumps of hair, again, blood, drag marks, because again, lions they're going to drag an animal to brush, trees, a place where they feel safe and eat, right? Basically, they're trying to hide their kill from another animal coming and taking it. So it's where they feel secure. And so they're going to feed like a bear. They're going to feed on that animal when they're full. Lions have a little different behavior. They will cover it up with leaves, pine needles. I've even seen them cover up an entire elk carcass with snow, just entombed in snow, and then when they're hungry, they'll come back and they'll feed on it again until there's nothing.
Okay. And what about the dispersal of those remains? What have you seen in all the kill sites you've examined in terms of how far they bring different parts of the animal, et cetera?
Well, I mean, like mean like more than just the animal itself, or?
Yeah, what do they do? What do they typically do with the carcass?
Nothing. They consume it, and when there's nothing left for them to consume, they abandon it.
So we talked about bears and mountain lions. Are either of these animals the type of animals that'll take a body part and run away with it?
No. So no, they're like I said, they will. I mean, they're top of the food chain in Colorado, black bears and mountain lions. So once they're eaten, there's nothing left, they'll abandon it and leave it for the other animals to come and scavenge.
Okay. So, and you talked about 100 yards, 50 to 100 yards on a bear. What about a mountain lion?
You know, they might go a little bit farther, just because they seem to be more willing to move the animal to a secure, safe location. But 100 or 200 yards that's a pretty far distance to drag something.
Okay. Do they prefer, in the sites you've seen, do they drag uphill, downhill? Does that make a difference?
I've never seen a preference. It's just, let's get to a safe, secure spot before they start consuming the prey.
Got it. And then let's talk about coyotes too. I don't know if everyone's familiar with coyotes, but are they a large enough predator to kill a large animal, or are they more of a scavenger?
So coyotes are they're like bears. They're omnivores. Bears eat a lot of plants and eat meat. Coyotes prefer fresh meat. People have probably seen them out in fields hunting rodents. So they'd rather eat rodents, rabbits, squirrels, but they're also very opportunistic. And so they will eat carrion, and carrion is a scientific word for decaying flesh from a dead animal. So they don't mind coming and eating carrion after something else has left a carcass or something has died naturally in the woods or whatever. They'll take full advantage of it.
Okay. And you talked about animals feeding. Do all animals do sort of a survival analysis on their energy and their nutrition?
Yeah, if you're a wild animal, it's all about where's your next meal coming from and conserving energy. Otherwise, you starve to death.
So would that apply to bears and mountain lions in terms of how far they're going to bother to drag something?
Yeah.
Okay. Would that apply to coyotes in terms of how far they would want to carry something, for example?
Yeah, it's got to have a nutritional value. Sure.
So what have you seen in the field in terms of coyotes feeding and what they do?
Well, I mean, so like if are you talking about like if they were to be the next animal to encounter like a carcass after a bear or a lion left it?
Exactly.
So a coyote or a fox would come in, besides certain birds, magpies, ravens. They're all fighting for what's basically the crumbs. And so coyotes will chew on the bones if there's some flesh left. Maybe they'll be able to separate a bone from the skeleton. They'll grab it, maybe go a distance like a day bed or something, and feed on whatever's left for them, and then keep coming back to that again until there's nothing left for the animals to take advantage of.
So at times, for example, they'll take a small part of a carcass and take it to where they go to feed.
Yeah, if there's a chunk of meat, they'll grab a chunk of meat. If there's maybe a bone with some meat on it, they'll grab that. Sure.
So let's talk about considering all these animals together. When you've gone out to the hundreds of kill sites you've gone out to, what is the typical, considering each level of scavenging that we've talked about, what's the general area you look for the scope of the remains of one of these kills?
Well, when I get called, I mean, normally it's right there, because unless, I've had calls where people said, a deer was killed illegally or elk and illegal, and come to find out it was just killed by a lion or a bear or something. But it's pretty much where they told me it was, because it's been a day. For me to investigate, to look at something and determine the cause of death, the fresher the better. So if it's like a day or 2 days, anything more than that is really hard to determine the cause of death, for me anyway. So, because decomposition happens rapidly, especially in the summer.
Sure.
So yeah, when I get called, it's pretty much right there.
Okay. And then in your time in the field, you've seen kill sites from everything from old hunting kills to older cattle kills to the ones that you're fresh on.
Sure.
If you were to look for all the remains involved in that animal, what's the typical radius or distance that you'd be looking?
Well, I mean, I've seen, let's say I was working a poaching case and someone killed an animal illegally. and I had to go back, you know, I went back a couple months later, that spot. I mean, there's still parts of that animal there, skeleton, you know, parts of the bones and stuff, but it starts to get spread out over time, you know. I can't, you know, I'm not an expert in how far those bones go, but they do seem to kind of spread. So I couldn't tell exactly how far some of those travel.
What's been your experience in terms of how far, you talked about how far a bear or mountain lion would carry remains, right?
Well, yeah, they don't take care of remains anywhere. They eat it right there and they're done.
All right. And what's been your experience with coyotes? Like, how far have you seen one carry one of these bones you're talking about?
I would say a quarter mile, half mile would be extreme. You know, that's a pretty far distance.
Okay. That's the type of typical animal behavior.
At least what I see. Yes.
All right. I want to talk about some general scenarios with you. In talking about these, are these basically, am I capturing the three largest predators that we could talk about, or scavengers that we could talk about?
In 2012, yeah. I mean, since then we've had a pack of wolves moving to Colorado. In 2012, we didn't have any known wolves.
That's kind of cool. Is that in South Colorado or North?
The northwest corner.
Okay. All right. So considering these three animals that we've talked about, though, in your experience, what's the likelihood that any of these animals would kill a 13-year-old child who's close to the road?
Well, a coyote, I think there's only been one fatal coyote attack in the United States, and that was a small child. There's been 3 fatal lion attacks in Colorado, and including the unfortunate incident with a lady last month outside Durango.
Well, that was a bit, well, were we talking about lions or bears?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about people.
I am. I'm sorry. So let me back you up. So you said one coyote in the country.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes.
But specific to Colorado,
yeah,
just in terms of the likelihood?
No fatal coyote attacks in Colorado.
Okay. And then bears?
There's been 4 fatal attacks by wild black bears.
And one of them's the one that unfortunately just tragically happened?
Yes.
And then lions rare too?
There's been 3 fatal lion attacks in Colorado.
And we're talking about since the start of the state, the types of numbers?
Yeah.
Like years?
Well, Colorado's been a state for what, 145 years?
Long time.
Yeah, long time.
So bringing you back to the question I asked, based on animal behavior, what's the likelihood that a 13-year-old who's on a road or an ATV trail is going to get killed by wildlife?
Well, they're very, very unlikely to happen.
Now, we talked about Middle Mountain Road. I want to show you a couple maps real quick. I'm going to show Peoples 224 that's been previously admitted. The jury's seen this map before, so I don't want to belabor the point, but you reviewed this map and you're familiar with the topography up in those areas?
Correct.
All right. And then 223, please. Captures a few locations. The jury's seen this before too, but have you previously reviewed it?
Yes, I've seen this.
Okay. So you know the locations and the distances and the terrains that we're going to talk about dispersal of remains in here in a second?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So I want to ask you about a couple of scenarios that might apply to these areas. So in terms of these animals distributing remains or doing anything with remains, are any of the animals we talked about going to take a body from that residence down there and bring it up to that Middle Mountain Road and normal animal behavior?
No, not in my experience, no.
Okay. And then talking about that location on Middle Mountain Road, that then you can see the line as the crow flies from site 2 to the skull?
Yeah.
And that goes up over, does that go up over Middle Mountain itself?
Well, so it's going to drop down that canyon to the east, and it climbs over the ridge, assuming it's a straight line.
Yeah.
It climbs over the ridge, over into what is the beginning, what they call Renlet Park.
Okay. That's about a 1,500-foot vertical climb from Middle Mountain up to the top of Middle Mountain there. Does that sound about right?
So
leading.
Hold on.
He's telling them what the data is. I mean, like, right?
Yeah, why don't you ask him?
Sure. Is that a significant vertical climb from the location on the Middle Mountain Road up to the peak of the mountain before you go back down into Runlet Park?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't, without looking at a topo map, I couldn't give you numbers, but it's a pretty steep climb. Yes, it's considerable.
Sure. Do animals travel in a straight line like we've drawn on the map?
Now, if you were to travel over there, I mean, you're going to have to cross a creek, down trees, boulders. So no, it's not a straight line. And like when you do from one point to the other point, to get a true distance, you have to lay that on the topography. And they're going down a valley over a hill, so I'll give you a truer distance.
Okay. So it's going to be much farther than what we put in the straight line.
Correct.
Can you...
Beating, move to strike, asked and answered.
You're overruled. He was just recharacterizing the testimony. That's fine.
Thank you, Judge. So let me ask you, based on normal animal behavior and the things you've already talked about, let's factor in this terrain in this area. Would you expect to see any animal carry a skull from down there all the way over into Runlet Park?
Can you be a little more clear about down there?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The middle location on Middle Mountain Road, over Middle Mountain down into Runlet Park. Can you see an animal, Can you see a normal animal behavior, any of these animals we've talked about, navigating that terrain and carrying a skull over there?
I couldn't see any reason for them to carry a skull over there. That's a long distance for no reason.
Have you ever seen anything like that in your time?
I have not.
Okay. Finally, let's talk about, you talked about the energy, nutritional kind of analysis that an animal does for survival, right? The animals move around inanimate objects that have no nutritional value.
No.
So do animals have any interest in moving things around like cell phones or wallets or backpacks, things like that?
If a backpack had some kind of food in it, they would tear it up to get the food out, but to just carry it around or a cell phone, no, there's no interest.
So if animals were feeding on a person for any reason, would you expect those articles would stay relatively close by? Okay. Have you, in your 26 years, ever examined a human kill site where the human was killed by an animal?
I have not.
Why not?
Because they're so rare, they just don't happen very often. So I'm glad I was retired and didn't have to get involved in this latest incident.
But in the 26 years that you were here, did any humans killed by animals?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Bogan?
Yes, please. Building on the conversation you were just having with the prosecutor, you've been a wildlife manager, it sounds like, for 20, or you were a wildlife manager for 26 years, correct?
Correct.
And you recited for us what those responsibilities entailed, and it included doing kill site investigation, correct?
Yes.
And as you just testified, all of those kill sites regarded either kills of livestock or other wild animals, if I understand correctly.
Correct.
And it sounds like those investigations, when we're talking about livestock, were to determine what kind of animal killed the livestock, to see if the rancher was entitled to compensation from the state.
That's correct.
And it sounds like there's also investigations where you'll be investigating a kill of a wild animal to see if that was a predator or poaching.
Yes.
And you said something that caught my attention, that generally your investigations, you try and get in there to these animal kill sites within a day or two, correct?
Yeah, that for various reasons, yes.
Explain those reasons.
Let's say, as soon as something dies, decomposition takes over quickly. So, especially in the summer. So, decomposition takes over. Other animals could come in and start feeding on that animal. If there's a bear in the area, maybe that bear didn't kill the animal. Maybe the animal died from natural cause. But a bear comes in, it'll start consuming that, or a coyote. And so I like to get to them quickly before they're consumed, and then I can't tell what killed that animal. So just so I have a clear picture, that's why.
And it sounds like, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, when we're talking about decomposition, the clock's moving pretty quickly.
It is. You have the bacteria, just natural decomposition of bacteria. Summertime, you have flies that lay eggs, and maggots hatch real fast. Magpies grow, crows, ravens, all kinds of birds. Everything's joining in and just having that animal or whatever it is start to decompose real quick.
And your expertise lies in doing an analysis of these animal carcasses as soon as you can get to them.
Correct.
And you wouldn't venture an opinion if you were faced with a kill site that was only skeletal remains.
No, I wouldn't have any expertise in this skill.
And you listed several factors, including animals, that contribute to decomposition: birds, coyotes, insects, flies, and some of these apex predators will scavenge as well, correct?
That's correct.
And when I say apex, we're talking bears?
Bears, yes. Lions aren't to a small degree. They might feed on some. They like to eat stuff that's they killed and is fresh. If it's winter time and they're desperate, I have seen them feed on like a deer that got hit by a car or something, but it was fresh and they would take advantage of it. But that's not very common.
Lions will scavenge, not very common.
Not very common. Yeah.
And when you've taken all of your investigations seriously because you want to know if there was a poacher and you want to know if a rancher needs to be compensated, right?
Well, yeah, and I need to know, was that a lion that's going to come back the next night and the next night, or, so we can solve the problem.
Right. And when you're trying to figure out what killed an animal, you're looking at the carcass and you're looking at all the attendant circumstances around it as well, correct?
Yes, you got to look at the big picture just so you can gather as many facts as you can.
And it sounds like you're an expert on how bears and mountain lions kill things, right?
Oh, I've seen a fair amount. So.
And talking about mountain lions, you said they stalk and ambush their prey. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then they'll run up on it, and that initial impact can be catastrophic for what they're trying to get, right?
Well, they grab on, they latch on, and then they start fighting neck, head, face, trying to kill the animal. Sure.
Can you venture an opinion on how fast a mountain lion will hit their prey?
No, I don't. I couldn't.
And you testified on direct that because mountain lions and bears are kind of at the top of the food chain, they don't really need to drag remains long distances, right?
No, they're really nothing's. I mean, a lion would kill, like, say, whatever it kills. The only thing that's going to take it away from them would be a bear. And so, yeah, they're really not. They drag off and they'll feed, but again, they don't know that. They don't know what's coming around the corner, so they're going to feed on that in a secure, safe spot.
And a couple things to follow up on there. The numbers that you estimated that you provided the jury were a bear will maybe carry a carcass or whatever 50 to 100 yards based upon your experience, your observations.
Correct. I mean, I've seen them, like, say, you're a sheep rancher, and they graze a lot of sheep on the forest in the summertime. I run in and grab a lamb, run 50 yards back in the trees and consume that, stuff like that. And
mountain lions a little bit further distance. I think you characterize that as could be up to 100, 150 yards.
I've never seen more than that. I mean, we would get calls sometimes, like in Durango, city limits, there's lots of deer. A lion might kill a deer in someone's backyard and drag it 50 feet, just whatever that animal felt secure. So.
And you said one thing that caught my attention, that one of the reasons a mountain lion's not going to carry these items very far is because the only thing that's going to take it from them is a bear. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, it's a bear would be more dominant than a lion. So let's say a lion has killed a deer and it's feeding on it. Bears I always call a bear with a stomach on 4 legs, you know. And so all of a sudden you have competition, right? Who's more dominant? So I could see a bear pushing that lion off its kill because it's going to take over and consume the rest of the animal.
And safe to say, if a bear can take meat, whatever, a kill from a mountain lion, it could also do that with other animals, correct?
Sure. Oh yeah.
You had a bunch of coyotes, bear comes along, is like,
sure,
mine now.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a fight.
And that's a behavior you know about from your expertise and experience.
Mm-hmm. They're top dog.
However, one thing you said on direct is, despite all your experience out on the field, and it sounds like it's been a lot, you wouldn't characterize yourself as an expert on how far bones will go from a particular kill site.
Yeah, you know, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. I've like I said, I've seen lots of skeletons turned into piles of bones over the years, but I couldn't qualify myself as expert on how far they're going to disperse over time.
And talking about coyotes, it's your expert opinion based on experience that a coyote might carry a bone or a piece of meat or remains quarter to a half mile in your experience.
Yeah, they don't seem to travel. I mean, lots of times you'll see them just sitting there on that carcass cleaning up what's left. But if they do grab something and run off, they're not going to go real far because they're going to come back when they get a chance.
But I think you characterize that as maybe a quarter to a half mile earlier.
In my experience, yes.
Right. And out of all the animals we've talked about this morning, the ones who are most likely to carry a bone away from the original site would be a coyote or fox.
Sure, and foxes are small. I mean, a red fox is 15 pounds, so they're not going to carry anything very heavy very far.
Bigger bones can be carried by a coyote as opposed to other canids.
Sure.
But for wolves, which aren't in this area.
Not 2012.
One of the things you got asked on direct was based upon your experience, your observations of these animals, was what was the likelihood of a child, a 13-year-old, getting killed by one of these animals? And when I ask that question, I'm referring to lions and bears. How likely that would be in 2012 up in Middle Mountain? Remember, that was one of the last questions. Mm-hmm. And you said it was unlikely, right?
I don't know if I said very highly unlikely. I'm not sure.
Right, right. And that's based upon your research and your understanding of Colorado history, however long we've had a state.
Well, just knowing every year there's millions of people that recreate in bear habitat in Colorado, and the number of bear fatalities, the odds are extremely high.
And even with those odds, you're familiar with the recent bear kill here up by around Trimble.
Sure, I was shocked just because it was so rare.
No further questions, Judge.
Redirect? Very briefly, Your Honor. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on this point, since we explored it and then counsel explored it as well. We were talking about coyotes might carry a bone from a quarter mile to a half mile. But I think in your direct examination, you said that would be the extreme example.
I think so, yeah. Like I said, it's normally, you see them on a carcass, they're eating what they can eat. If they have to grab something, they're going to run off a distance, short distance, and then come back when you can. But to just grab something and run for distance, long distances, I've just never seen that.
And all these animals we're talking about, they're big enough and strong enough to do it if there was a reason to do it, right?
Sure, they all have the physical capabilities to do it. It's just the rationale is not there.
And that's just not their normal behavior. No. Okay. And then in your 26 years of experience in the field, and then your life experience as well, that's based on the Colorado terrain that's pertinent to our case, correct?
Yeah, correct. That's my office,
Right.
the woods
Right.
for my office. So I've looked at lots of topo maps. I've been all over the mountains and the wilderness. Yeah, that's where I work.
So if we're talking about what mountain lions do, we're talking what bears do, we're talking about what coyotes do. When we're talking to you, we're talking about Middle Mountain Road and that type of terrain.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions from the jury? No? Okay. This witness be excused?
By all means.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're free to go. Next witness?
People call Krystle Rodriguez to stand.
All right. Come up to the witness, stand up here, please. And if you'd raise your right hand before you sit down. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Have a seat.
May I inquire, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Can you please state your full name, spelling your first and last name for the court reporter?
Sure. It's Krystle Rodriguez, KrystlRodriguez.
How are you currently employed?
I am currently employed at University of North Texas Center for Human ID.
What kind of work is done at the Center for Human ID?
We process missing persons case work samples for DNA.
Approximately how many cases are worked per year at the center?
We do a few thousand family reference samples per year and hundreds of unidentified human remains samples per year.
And how would you explain the mission of the laboratory in which you work?
Our mission is to help in the identification of remains that are found that the law enforcement agency doesn't know who those remains are of. And so our work is to help aid medical examiner offices and coroner offices in making those positive identifications.
What's your current role within the laboratory?
Currently, I'm the assistant technical leader.
What does that mean?
So I function as a forensic analyst. I'm capable of conducting the laboratory testing procedures and doing the data analysis. I also do comparisons and generate statistics based on those comparisons and issue reports. I also act as the training coordinator for our newly hired DNA analyst and technologist. And I participate in our annual internal audit and help the technical leader with validation studies and anything else that she needs for our laboratory to help meet our goal.
Just briefly, what's the purpose of the audits and validation studies you just referenced?
So we're an accredited laboratory, and so that means that a nonprofit, our accrediting agency is ANAB. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that. So that just means that a nonprofit, non-government agency comes into our laboratory every other year, and they audit us against the FBI quality assurance standards and the ISO 17025 document for forensic testing laboratories and forensic databasing laboratories. So we also conduct internal audits on ourselves. All these audits are to ensure that we're following the standards and making sure that we're following our policies and procedures.
Can you walk the jury through your education, please?
Sure. I first obtained a bachelor's of biology at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, and then I continued my education at the University of North Texas Health Science Center to obtain my Master's of Science in Forensic Genetics.
And I'd like you to walk the jury through your employment experience, please.
Once I graduated with my master's degree, I was hired on at the Center for Human ID, which is located at the University of North Texas Health Science Center. I was initially hired as a forensic technician, in which I trained for 1 year to become a forensic analyst. And so I was a forensic analyst and then continued my career, became a senior forensic analyst, and then in 2019, I became the assistant technical leader there.
When did you start at the center?
2007, but I did work there my second year of my master's program just as a student worker, helping stock the labs and things like that.
So as a student initially and then full-time since 2007?
Correct.
And how has your role changed over time at the laboratory?
I've just gained more responsibility there. Yeah.
Can you tell us, please, if you've ever been a part of any publication related to the work of the laboratory?
Yes, I have a publication but when I was applying for graduate school, it was based on a study of suicides in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania.
And how about presentations related to the subject area?
I presented my master's thesis.
On what?
It was on the whole genome sequencing using a microarray for mitochondrial DNA testing.
Have you been qualified as an expert previously in forensic DNA analysis?
Yes, I have.
On approximately how many occasions?
A little over a dozen times.
Where were those court proceedings held?
So several were in the state of Texas, which we do a lot of casework for, and then I've also testified in Kansas, Tennessee, Michigan, and done some video testimony for Florida.
Your Honor, at this time, the people would move to qualify this witness as an expert in forensic DNA analysis.
No objection.
Should be so qualified.
Ms. Rodriguez, the jury's heard, I'd say, a lot of testimony about DNA evidence, so I'm going to move us fairly quickly through this part of your testimony. Okay?
Sure, okay.
When did you first become involved in the case involving a young boy named Dylan Redwine?
Our laboratory received a skull from La Plata County Sheriff's Office, and I was the case analyst that processed the case.
And I see you opening a binder in front of you. Is that reports related to this particular case?
Yes, this is the case, copies of the case file, which you also have.
Right. And you provided those so it could be part of the prosecution file and provided to the defense?
Correct.
Okay. If you need to refresh your recollection at any point, if you're going to look down, just let us know.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's the part of the court process. Just let us know if you're going to be looking down to
Sure.
refresh your recollection.
Okay.
We'll put it on the record, okay?
Okay, sure.
And how did the laboratory first become involved in the case involving Dylan?
We were submitted the skull for DNA analysis.
Is that something the laboratory does on a regular basis?
Yes.
And that's with regards to the number of cases you mentioned at the start of your testimony? That's the kind of work you do?
That's correct.
What do you require from law enforcement, if anything, before you begin your analysis?
We require that they determine that the skeletal remains are of human origin. That way our testing, it doesn't waste our resources because we won't get results if it's not human remains.
So you require law enforcement to go through a process to determine that the remains are actually human before you begin your process?
Correct. So just a report from the medical examiner's office or an anthropologist saying that they looked at the remains and determined it to be human origin.
And is that something that was done in this case?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, when had the cranium or skull been found?
I would have to look at our submission form.
The court's permission, I'd ask you to take a look at your submission form and see if that refreshes your recollection as to the date that the cranium has been found.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
And while you're doing that, I'll tell you that I'm going to be asking you next when the laboratory received the cranium or skull.
Okay. Listed here on our submission form, the date the remains were found was November 3rd, 2015.
And when did the laboratory receive the remains?
The laboratory received the human skull from Sergeant Izell on December 11th, 2015.
And if you could, just in your own words, walk the jury through the process that the laboratory followed after receiving the cranium in question.
Sure. So the first thing that happens when we receive evidence at our laboratories, our evidence custodians receive the evidence and they do an inspection on that evidence. So at that time, they're looking that the evidence is properly sealed, that there's no stains, leaking, tears in the packaging. And then once that's been determined and documented, then we log it into our system where it's assigned a unique case number and item number, and that's used for tracking through the whole process at our laboratory. It's then stored in our evidence vault, which is secure, until we're ready to begin testing. And so once we're ready to begin, then we retrieve the evidence from the evidence vault. And the first thing that we do is perform the evidence examination. And so to do that, we take written description of the evidence and take photographs. And once it's all been documented, then we're ready to begin removing our sample from that evidence to carry through the testing process. So the first thing that we do is sand the area that we're going to be removing a piece of bone from. That's to get rid of any dirt and debris that would be on the outside of the skull. And then we take about 1 to 7 grams worth of the evidence and we cut it in small pieces. And then those small pieces get sent through a decontamination process, and that's just a series of washes of bleach, water, and ethanol. And that's to further remove any other dirt, bone powder that got on the bone pieces during the cutting process and any extraneous contamination DNA. And then once the bone pieces have been cleaned, we grind that into powder, and that's to prepare it for the next step, which is DNA extraction. It's important to have it ground into bone powder because it provides more surface area for our reagents to break down the mineral deposits, the calcium phosphate and the proteins, the collagen that's in the structure of the bone, because the bone cells are entangled in all of that calcium and the protein.
Can I stop you there?
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
No.
Is that the process you followed in this case?
Yes.
How did you decide where to take the sample from?
So in this case, we were told by the agency to remove an area at the back of the skull.
What was the reason for that?
They didn't give a distinct reason, but often we're asked by agencies to, test a certain bone or test a certain area. It's not uncommon to have that, but.
And this was after the skull or cranium had been examined by a forensic anthropologist?
Yes. There was an answer report that was included in the submission paperwork.
So based on that input, it looked like from what you were demonstrating that you were going to take a sample from the back of the skull.
Yes, they actually drew where they wanted us to cut from.
And I have a couple follow-up questions on what you just described, okay?
Sure.
What's the reason that you actually have to cut a sample out from the bone, or in this case, the skull?
You have to remove some of the bone sample so that it can be used in the testing process. You have to be able to get the DNA from the bone that way because you have to break it down.
Is it possible to simply just swab the skull or cranium?
No, sir.
So what do you use to cut into the bone, or in this case, into the cranium?
So it's called a striker saw. It's what's standardly used for autopsies at MEs and coroner's offices.
How does the striker saw work?
It has a blade on the end of it that vibrates, and then it relies on you putting pressure on it to send the blade through the bone to cut it.
And what's the process for using the striker saw in a case such as this? What do you actually do?
You just assemble it, turn it on, and you can precisely cut where you want to, and you just make a series of cuts so that the piece of bone falls out, and then you collect it.
Where is that done? I'm just looking for you. I know this is your everyday work.
Oh, okay.
For a lot of people here, they probably have never been a part of this process. So,
sure.
Or seen an autopsy, for example. So with the striker saw in your laboratory, what's the actual process?
So we have a special room set up for cutting samples like this. And so we have, we call them cutting hoods, and so they have a stainless steel bottom that has a grate with holes and plexiglass sides and a door to protect us from anything, you know, splattering out at us. And so then also we have like a vacuum that sucks the bone powder as we're cutting so that we don't breathe it in. We have, you know, PPE on, ear protection, an N95 mask. And so, yeah, the process is done inside these cutting hoods where we sand it and cut, and all of the bone powder is sucked into the vacuum and away from the sample. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Obviously, you're using the striker saw to cut into the bone. Yeah. How are you treating the cranium or skull otherwise?
Well, we're trained, I mean, we know this is a human being's remains that we're working with, so we're always treating it with as much respect as, you know, always treating it with respect, and also only taking what's necessary for us to do our testing. So we only use as much pressure as we need to get through, you know, to actually cut the bone. So some force is needed, but, you know, not excessive.
Thank you. And were photos taken of the cranium, in this case, before and after the sample was cut?
Yes, the cranium was photographed before the cutting, and then we just take one picture after we're done cutting to show where we cut from and how much was taken.
Your Honor, can I approach the witness with what's been previously marked as People's 388
Yes,
identification? You can show them to counsel. Ms. Rodriguez, what is Exhibit 388?
These are our evidence photographs. So it looks like the bottom picture was before cutting, and the top picture was after we removed the sample for testing.
Do those photos fairly and accurately depict how the cranium or skull looked before in one photo and after in another photo the cutting was done?
Yes, that's correct.
Your Honor, at this time, the people would move 388 into evidence, please.
Defense?
No objection.
388 is admitted.
Thank you. And with the court's permission, I'd like to put it on the screen just briefly.
Go ahead.
And Ms. Rodriguez, while we get the magnification right on this screen, I'll just tell you, you obviously see it on the screen behind you, but you have the exhibit in front of you as well, and you can look at whichever one you're more comfortable looking at.
Okay. Yeah, the one in front of me is more comfortable.
Okay. What do we see in the bottom photograph on Exhibit 388, please?
The bottom photograph is the skull before it was cut for testing.
And where were these photographs taken?
We have an accessioning room that adjoins to the cut room where we have our evidence lockers in there, and so when we examine the evidence and take the pictures and the written description, as I had mentioned earlier, that's all done in this small room that's enclosed.
And how about the top photo, Ms. Rodriguez?
That, it was taken after the portion was removed for testing.
We could take that down. Thank you. So the top photograph showed us where you took out the portion for testing.
Correct.
In your own words, can you just walk the jury through what was done in terms of the testing? You started to touch on it, but I'd love for you to just explain the process to the jury.
So pick up at DNA extraction?
Yes.
Okay. So as I had mentioned, we grind the bone into bone powder, and then we add our reagents, which break down the calcium and the minerals of the bone and the proteins. And these reagents also, they burst open the bone cells, releasing the DNA into the liquid. And then the rest of the DNA extraction process purifies this DNA and concentrates it down so that it's ready for us to use in the next step of testing. And so for autosomal SDRs, we use commercially available kits. In this case, we used a case that interrogates 15 different locations on the DNA that has been found to differ between individuals. Except for identical twins, they will produce the same DNA profile. And And so we use this kit and an instrument to make hundreds and thousands of copies of the DNA at these 15 locations. And then that's put on another instrument that separates all these fragments out and collects the data, which we do our DNA analysis on to determine what the profile is from the evidence sample.
When this work was done on this particular case, what kit was your laboratory using at that time?
We were using Identifiler Plus at the time.
Are you still using that kit today?
And not anymore.
Fair to say there continues to be advances in DNA technology from when our career started to where we are today?
That is correct. And in the field, we expanded the number of loci that we look at now. So now we use a kit that looks at more locations on the DNA.
And what? It's okay. What kit are you using at the laboratory now?
Right now, we're using Promega's Fusion 5C kit.
How many locations does the Promega kit allow you to locate?
That looks at 22 different autosomal loci.
And at the time of this analysis, you were using Identifiler, which focused on 15 loci.
Correct.
You just mentioned one thing I want to follow up on about the DNA analysis, making copies. Can you just explain to the jury what you mean by that, please?
So we have in the kit, it has certain pieces of DNA that attach to these target areas that we're looking at. And so the enzymes within this kit provide everything that's needed to sequence that DNA and make a copy of it, and it keeps doing this over multiple cycles to get exponential growth of the number of copies of the DNA at these targeted regions.
And specifically, what kind of DNA analysis was conducted on that sample?
So we did autosomal STR testing, and we performed mitochondrial DNA testing, but that wasn't actually used in the comparison. We just standardly do those two types of testing on unidentified skeletal remains that are going to be entered into the code of safety.
So you used autosomal STR for the identification process.
That's correct. They have the higher power of discrimination to be able to differentiate individuals.
What were the results of your analysis in this particular case, Ms. Rodriguez?
May I refer to my report?
Yes, if you can just let us know what you're looking at and whether it refreshes your recollection.
Yes, I was going to look at the genetic comparison, and it's on the second page of the report to refresh my memory.
Go ahead. Sure. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, Adam.
So when we compared the profile obtained from the skull, we compared that to the direct reference sample that was provided by the, it was provided when the skull was submitted to our laboratory, and it was generated by the CBI laboratory from a baby tooth of Dylan Redwine.
So you had the direct reference sample, and in layperson terms, what does that mean?
It's just the DNA profile that was generated from a baby tooth.
Of Dylan.
Of Dylan, yeah, sorry.
And go on then, please.
Okay, so we did the comparison. So at every location, we compared our profile to the profile provided by CBI, and at every location, it was concordant between the two profiles. And so at that point, when there's concordance between two profiles, you cannot exclude it from originating from the same individual. And so then to further look into that, we run a statistical calculation called random match probability. And this is to measure the significance of that inclusion, of that concordance between the profiles, and to give you an idea of how often you would expect to see this profile in the population.
So when you say cannot exclude, it's fair to say that's a term of art that you use?
Yeah, that's just the term that we use, meaning that it was concordant and they're included.
Okay. And then you do the random
match probability.
To determine what?
That's the frequency of the profile in the population. It's a way to give you a measure of significance for the fact that the the profile from the evidence sample matched that profile of the reference sample from Dylan Redwine.
Go on, please.
So in my report, I stated that the nuclear DNA profile observed from the skull and from the DRS sample has an estimated frequency of occurrence of 1 in approximately 27 quintillion Caucasian individuals, 1 in approximately 2.6 sextillion African American individuals, and 1 in approximately 30 quintillion Southwestern Hispanic individuals. Now, we always report the statistics for random match for the 3 major populations in the U.S., but I'm going to focus on the statistics for the Caucasian individuals in my explanation for you, since that's what Dylan was designated to be. So the 1 in approximately 27 quintillion Caucasians is 27 with 18 zeros behind it. And so this is a very large number. Currently, the Earth's population is a little bit above 7 billion, and so that's a 7 with 9 zeros behind it. So in theory, in order to see this profile again from some random person in the population, you'd have to look through 1 billion Earth populations.
So in your expert opinion, what were you able to conclude from this analysis?
So in absence of there being an identical twin, it's in my scientific opinion that the skull and the baby tooth originated from the same male individual, and I would expect an ME or coroner to make a positive identification off of this DNA work.
You say positive identification to whom?
To Dylan Nicholas Redwine.
And the notification would be to his family?
Correct. The ME, the medical examiner or coroner is who has the authority to designate a positive identification, and we're typically just a tool that's used to do that.
Right. So when you concluded your analysis and generated the report, who did you share that information with?
The report was sent to the Sheriff's Office, La Plata County Sheriff's Office.
And approximately when did that take place?
Can I look at my report to see the date, please?
Your Honor? Yes. Thank you.
Our report was issued on May 24th, 2016.
What was done with the cranium of Dylan Redwine?
It was picked up by Sergeant Isdell, who dropped it off for us as well.
You retain any portion of Dylan's skull at the laboratory?
Yes, an archive sample is retained. We do this standard for our cases because as time goes on, science gets better, or if there's ever a question, we have something to go back to retest.
Your Honor, I have nothing further. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez.
You're welcome.
Mr. Bogan?
Briefly. Could you tell us the steps that you go through in preparing the bone for a DNA analysis? And by that I mean, you say you try to get rid of contaminants. Can you reiterate that for the jury, please?
Sure. So after we've taken the documentation of the evidence, we sand down the region of the bone that we're going to sample from, and that's to remove any dirt and debris. Because a lot of times these skeletal remains are out in the elements and soil, so that all needs to be removed. And then once the pieces have been cut, then we send that through a more intense cleaning steps, which are the washes. So we use bleach, water, and ethanol to clean the surface of the bone to further remove any dirt. And then you just never know who has handled the remains before, too. Sometimes whoever finds them can pick it up, and so they wouldn't have gloves on. So we would want to make sure that any contaminant DNA on the outside of it was removed during the cleaning process, so that the profile that we obtained from the sample is indeed from the bone.
And just one more topic, I think. You talked about how your lab is accredited, correct?
Correct.
And if I understand your description of that, that means a nonprofit agency, forgive the layperson term here, looks at the work and the procedures you're doing at the lab and then compares that to the Federal Bureau of Investigation quality assurance standards.
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
I got the impression that part of your accreditation process includes comparing your procedures and practices to FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation practices.
That's semi-correct. So the FBI has issued national standards for all of us as a forensic community to follow, and they're known as the FBI Quality Assurance Standards. And so it's not that they're auditing us that we do exactly what the FBI does, but it's that the FBI generated these standards that we all have to follow.
The FBI sets the standards for labs that deal with these sorts of materials.
Yes, there are national standards.
Nothing further, Judge.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Any questions from the jury? No? Can she be excused?
Yes, Your Honor, please.
Yes, please.
All right, you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next prosecution witness?
Your Honor, we can see this one witness, but we're a little bit behind schedule. Would it be appropriate to take a morning break?
I'd prefer not to, just because it'll screw us up on the back end of that. Yeah, go ahead.
Your Honor,
If you have to, we have to. But yes.
sorry, the witness animated exhibit.
Oh, could you put it back, please? Thank you. Okay. Come on back up, Mr. Heidel. And Mr. Heidel, you're still under oath.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
So this is going to be a very limited direct examination, just to two maps that are separate and apart from the topic that we were discussing the last time you testified. Do you understand?
Yes.
Did you create some Google Earth maps showing the location of both the first remains site, the location of the skull, and Mr. Redwine's home?
Yes.
If I showed you those exhibits, would you recognize them?
Yes.
I've got here exhibits 518 and 519, if I may approach.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you recognize those, sir?
Yes.
And what are they?
They are Google Earth screen captures of three locations.
Okay. Have you been to each one of those locations personally?
I have.
Okay. And as you review those two maps, are they a fair and accurate depiction of those locations?
Yes, they are.
At this time, we would move to admit exhibits 518 and 519.
Mr. Moran?
No objection, thanks.
They're both admitted.
This time, I have no further questions. Well, let's go ahead and publish them just to take a moment for this to show them to the jury. So please publish exhibit 518. Okay. Can you show us, and using the pointer, can you step down and show us what we have here on this map?
The yellow line is the outline of Middle Mountain Road. There's Mark Redwine's residence. This is the first recovery site. And then this is a recovery site of the premium.
Now, the jury's seen many different maps now of these two topics, but this is just a slightly different angle, is that right?
That's correct.
And exhibit 519?
Again, just a different angle. Mr. Redwine's home, first recovery site, second recovery site.
Okay. Thank you, sir. You're welcome to have a seat. I have no further questions for you.
Any cross on that?
Yes, please, quickly. Good morning again, Mr. Heidel.
Morning.
You're getting the frequent flyer of the witness box. So when you're creating these images, it's through Google Earth, you plug in the longitude and latitude, right?
That's correct. Sometimes.
Yeah, right, okay. With respect to the maps that we've just published to the jury, those are based on longitude and latitude.
That's correct.
I suppose Mr. Redwine's house is just based on plugging in the address.
No, actually, I can see
that location on Google Earth, so I can just put a marker on there or a pin on there, exactly where it is.
I see. With respect to remain site 1, where are you dropping the pin? How are you determining? Is it based on an item, or is there a specific longitude and latitude that you?
Sure, it's where what's been described as the main location. I think it's been described as the dump site, where the initial between the 2 logs. That's the location I use for that, the GPS location.
I see. I prefer remain site. I'm going to call it that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Remain site 1 then is established based on those 2 downed logs. We heard testimony, and I think you were in the courtroom, by Sergeant Brenner and Investigator Patterson.
That's correct.
Okay, and those 2 individuals described finding, my recollection was, bone at those 2 downed trees.
Yes.
And black fabric that turned out to be Dylan's T-shirt.
Yes.
And kicker earbuds were at that downed tree.
Correct.
So you're using the longitude and latitude of that spot to create the pin for remain site 1.
That's correct.
Thank you. That's all I have at this point.
Can I take care of you?
Yes, thank you.
Jury? I don't think so. You stepped down. Do you need some more time? I mean, we can take a break if you need to.
Your Honor, we have another witness ready to go. She's the next witness. Start. Great.
Let's go till about 10, because otherwise it's just too long for Aaron to keep working.
Of course. So. Your Honor, people call Diane France.
All right. Hey, Ms. France, if you would raise your right hand before you sit down. Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Have a seat.
May I inquire, Your Honor?
You may.
Thank you. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I am doing well, thank you. And you?
Doing well. Thanks for asking. Can you introduce yourself to the jury, please, spelling your last name for the record?
Yes, my name is Diane France, F-R-A-N-C-E.
How are you employed?
I am self-employed. I'm a forensic anthropologist and the director of the Human Identification Laboratory of Colorado in Fort Collins.
Can you please tell the jury a little bit about your day-to-day work at the lab?
That really varies. Some days I am trying to work up cases, trying to do identifications, or at least assist with identifications as a forensic anthropologist, or determine the circumstances surrounding death based on human remains. And other days I am out in the field trying to look for clandestine graves or look for remains, and to help exhume those remains if they're buried, or to collect those remains and map them out if they are on the surface. Some days I am making casts or writing books or writing publications. So it just really varies, just depending on what somebody needs of me.
I'd like to go through your education and career experience in order to bring us to how you ended up in this role that you have today.
Okay.
Okay. Can you tell the jury about your education, please?
I received a BA from CSU and an MA in 1976, and a master's also from CSU in 1979, and then I received my PhD in 1983 from the University of Colorado. I was then board certified in 1989 by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology.
And do you remain board certified up until and including today?
Yes, yes. I've been board certified the entire time since 1989.
Dr. France, let's turn to your career experience.
Okay.
Where did you start in 1988?
Actually in 1983, after I received my PhD, I went up to teach at Colorado State University. My former husband was employed there at the time and teaching. And so I went up and started teaching forensic anthropology classes at CSU. In 1988, I was an adjunct professor and remained an adjunct professor to this day, adjunct faculty. So I was teaching at CSU for a time, and then, well, shall I go into my casting experience at this time? It probably would be appropriate to do so. So in the early 70s, I became interested in making molds and casting bones and various materials. I was watching a fellow graduate student making a mold for his thesis, and I just became interested in it. Thought I'd just play around with it a little bit, and so I did. The first cast I made was a bowl of peanuts for a patty, and it was pretty obvious that they were fake peanuts, but it was fun to do. When I started teaching at Colorado State, I realized that I just didn't have the bones I needed to be able to teach forensic anthropology. And so and also primatology and just general physical anthropology. And so I borrowed an orangutan skeleton, made a mold of everything, every bone individually on that orangutan skeleton, and made casts of it so that I could use those to teach. And when I was teaching, I taught with that skeleton for a while, and then after that, I decided to develop a business, a casting business, while still maintaining my status as a forensic anthropologist. And so I developed a business and finally sold that in about 10 years ago. So most of it, I kept some of it. So much of my day-to-day work at that time, when I wasn't doing forensic anthropology, was actually making molds and casts of various materials that people were loaning me so that I could make casts for them and make casts to sell and so on and so forth. So basically that was kind of my path, while still maintaining my status as a forensic anthropologist.
Just to close the loop on the casting experience you had, when did you start that casting business?
I actually hired employees in 1985.
How long did you have the casting business?
It was until 2011.
And what kind of things were you being asked to cast or mold during that time?
Oh my goodness, it was kind of a neat process. I cast the remains of 18th dynasty queens in Cairo. I was asked to cast a lot of things for the Smithsonian, also for the National Zoo. So I made a mold and a cast of a living tiger's tongue while he was being sedated for dental work. That was probably the neatest thing I did in the casting business. Cast tiger's paw, skulls for a tiger. This is all for the Great Cats exhibit at the National Zoo. I cast the brains of a fin whale, an elephant, a human, an orangutan, and a squirrel for the think tank exhibit at the National Zoo. Made casts of 80,000-year-old bone harpoon points from Zaire in the Smithsonian. Cast Civil War specimens, pathology mostly, from the National Museum of Health and Medicine. I cast the skull of Jesse James when he was exhumed in 1994. So I cast his skull. Various kinds of opportunities. Really fun.
And turning to your work as a forensic anthropologist and other work you've done that might be of relevance to the jury, in 1990, you start working with the Colorado Body Identification.
That's right. It was a group of multidisciplinary individuals. We had a pathologist and odontologist, a dentist. We had law enforcement. We had body recovery experts, myself as a forensic anthropologist. We got together, there were 10 of us, and we got together and formed this group called the Colorado Body Identification Team, where we would respond to mass fatality incidents in Colorado mostly. We also went into Wyoming, but for the most part it was in Colorado. After that happened, in 1993, the federal government, headed by FEMA, this group was headed by FEMA, started the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team, or DMORT, which took over the response to mass fatality incidents around the country. And actually also, they respond to mass fatality incidents that like U.S. carriers, airplane carriers, in other parts of the world. So it's pretty wide-ranging. Well, as soon as that took over, then there was really no more need for the Colorado Body Identification Team. DMORT just took over all of that. So then the Body ID team was disbanded.
You serve as a member of DMORT?
I did. As a matter of fact, I think I was either the first or second forensic anthropologist to be a part of DMORT. When it was first starting in 1993, they asked me if I would be interested, and I said yes. And so I was part of that group until about 2002.
So, for example, just to explain the nature of that work, in 1997, did you respond to an airplane crash?
I did. In 1997, Korean Airlines Crash 801 crashed, landed just short of the runway in Guam. They were crossing over the hill just before you land at the airfield, and they clipped their landing gear on a big gas line just on the other side of the hill, and they crashed into the top of the mountain. 235 people were killed. Amazingly, about 35 people survived. But we were deployed in multiple groups because you can't all go as one group to the area because they didn't, if that plane crashed, and you didn't want to lose all of your recovery experts and your identification experts. So we all had to go in just small groups in separate planes, and we flew into Guam. It was difficult because it was 100 degrees, 100% humidity. It took us 3 days to get there, and so the bodies were decomposing for 3 days before we could even get there. But we set up a station in a big Navy Quonset hut where we had several different stations set up. So we had an intake station where they would figure out what was associated with each set of the remains, personal effects, and so on and so forth. They would catalog those and separate those. Then the body would go to radiology. So they would take full body x-rays of the remains. Then it would go to forensic odontology, so the dentist would take a look at the remains. Then it would go to the pathologist, and it would go to us, the forensic anthropologist. Each one of us had a station, and we would do what we do, and then send it on to the next station. The final station is where they are embalmed. In this particular case, they were not embalmed so much. They were just immediately casketed and then sent to a separate area where a group of Korean officials would come and they would perform a service and then take the remains back to South Korea. It's quite an experience.
So when you say each station would do what we do.
Right. So we would do the forensic anthropology. So a forensic anthropologist uses skeletal clues, whether or not there's still soft tissue on the remains. We use clues from the skeleton to try to determine or help determine identity and also the circumstances surrounding death. Circumstances surrounding death, of course, in this situation is pretty obvious because they were in a plane crash. But we were trying to help provide clues such as the age of the remains, the sex, the ancestry. Most of them are Koreans, but there were a few Americans on board. Stature, those sorts of things that we would then compare to records, medical records that we received from South Korea. So we would try to cross-compare and see who each set of remains belonged to.
Were you deployed, as another example, after 9/11? And if so, what work did you do?
Yes. So after 9/11, all the airports were closed and no airlines were flying. Ordinarily, with DMORT, I was expected to be on a plane within 4 hours after receiving notification. And so the morning, everybody remembers where they were in the morning of 9/11, right? So I was, after I saw the planes hit, I immediately packed my bags and set up the care for my dog and so on and so forth. I was not actually deployed for 2 weeks just because airlines weren't flying. And so after 2 weeks, then I was deployed to Staten Island, to the landfill in Staten Island. So they would go to ground zero and collect all of the debris from ground zero, put it on barges, and bring it over to the landfill where they would stack all of the debris, remains and everything else, stack all of the debris in these long lines in this mile it's a square mile area. And so they would stack all of this debris in like 40-foot stacks. So you had a path through these stacks to get to the debris. So they would pick up, using big trucks, and cranes and so on, they would pick up this debris and put all of it into these conveyor belts that would kind of shake everything into different size pieces, for want of a better term. So they would take all the big pieces and stack them. So all the big beams and the trucks and cars and everything, they would stack those in a separate area of the landfill. All of the medium and small debris, they would get a big backhoe and then just sort of just stagger it out along the ground. And hundreds of workers, all in white Tyvek suits, using rakes, would go through this debris, and then they would pick up anything that looked organic, either bone or soft tissue or anything like that, and they would put it into containers and bring it over to the NYPD trailer, which is where myself as a forensic anthropologist plus a graduate student, they always paired somebody senior with somebody more junior, we would go through it and determine whether or not the remains were human. If they were human, then we would send them on to the medical examiner's office. The medical examiner's office vowed to do DNA on every single piece of human remains to try to get them identified. And actually, it took them years to do that, but they did it. So basically, I spent 2 weeks there, 13-and-a-half-hour days for 14 days before, at that point, and this is standard practice, with DMOR, you do 13-and-a-half-hour days, and then you go home for at least a week, and then you can be redeployed if you need to. There were so many people interested in participating in 9/11 and with the recovery with 9/11 that they didn't need people twice. And so I spent 2 weeks and then went back home again.
Thank you, Doctor. So those are two examples of your work with DMOR.
Yes.
Let's transition now, if you would, and talk to the jury about NecroSearch. NecroSearch
is a fantastic organization. It is a group of about 45 individuals now, started in 88, I joined in 89. About 45 individuals, about a third are in law enforcement, a third in academia, and a third in private industry. Multidisciplinary, so we have geophysicists and geologists, botanists, myself as a forensic anthropologist. We have and a hydrologist, so many different experts in their fields who come together to form this multidisciplinary, volunteer, nonprofit organization. So when we respond to a case, we never charge for our time. We only charge for our expenses. So we are asked by law, and we only work with law enforcement. So when we're asked by law enforcement to help with a case.
Dr. Fran.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. What's the reason you only work with law enforcement?
I'm sorry, okay. So we only work with law enforcement to look for clandestine graves or look for remains because we don't want to interfere with a case. If we approached a family member, for example, and said, hey, we want to help you find your loved one's remains, then if law enforcement doesn't know that we're there, then we could inadvertently compromise a case by messing up the evidence, right? So we only work with law enforcement. So when we are contacted by law enforcement to assist with a case, we send out a questionnaire so that they can tell us about the case. Tell us about the height and weight of the victim. Tell us about the height and weight of the suspect. Tell us about areas that a suspect might frequent, for example. Tell us when the person was last seen. All kinds of questions. We take that questionnaire back and then go through it as a team, and everybody, the different expertise, goes through and has their ideas about what can be used, what kinds of techniques and methodology and so on that can be used to assist with the case.
How many cases have you worked on as part of the necro search team?
When I counted this up, gosh, it was probably almost a year ago now, we were at 322 cases. Now we've had a few cases since then, so we're probably up to about 340 now at this point.
Does that involve consulting with law enforcement and locating human remains?
It does. So our primary goal, we're kind of a cold case group. We are not usually contacted until the law enforcement just has run out of other options. They've run down every lead that they have. And so then they contact us and say, here's the case. Do you have any other ideas for us? We're kind of the group of last resort. So
Group of last resort when it comes to what?
when it comes to looking for clandestine graves and or scattered remains on the surface.
So in those 300 plus cases, your involvement has included the location of human remains and the analysis of the location.
Yes, the location of a clandestine grave or a location of something that of an anomaly, basically. So what we're looking for is something that looks out of place in the environment, and then we investigate whether or not that could be an individual, whether or not that actually is a grave.
Would that include, you mentioned clandestine graves, would that also include body dump sites?
Yes, body dump sites as well, yes. All we're doing, we're looking for human remains.
How many states and countries has NecroSearch worked in?
We are now up to 46 states, plus the District of Columbia, and 8 countries.
Can you talk a little bit about actually I'll transition to a different area for now.
Okay.
Just touch on briefly your work as within NecroSearch, what positions you held.
I have been vice president and president for several years for vice president, for president.
How about your work with the Laboratory for Human Identification?
The Laboratory for Human Identification was formed at CSU, and so I was the director of that for many years before that was eventually disbanded.
Can you talk to the jury, please, about your teaching experience, just briefly?
I do a lot of invited lectures around the world, actually. But also, I did do some teaching, of course, at Colorado State University. I do not routinely teach at a university at this point.
Talked about being the owner of the business involving casting.
Right, the France Casting, really unique name. So France Casting, and then when I sold most of that in 2011, I started a new casting business called France Custom Casting, which is where I make molds and casts of just items that are not just mass produced for sale. So things like, homicide cases cast for use in court. Also the whole think tank exhibit for the National Zoo and so on and so forth, those types of things.
Thank you, Dr. France. Can you tell us, please, about your board and professional memberships?
So I said that I was board certified by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology in 1989, and I have been on the board of directors. Actually, at midnight last night, I finished my 18th year, so I termed out, and I'm now off the board. I've spent 5 years as president of that organization and secretary as well, but I spent 5 years as president.
Can you tell us about your work with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences?
I'm also a fellow with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, which is, there are 2 big organizations for forensics in the world. One is the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and the other is the International Association for Forensic Science. But I've been a member of the Academy since 1984.
Have you also been a member of the scientific working group in forensic anthropology?
Yes. So there are 3 different groups that develop the standards and guidelines for best practice in forensic science. There are several scientific working groups in various forensic science disciplines. One is SWIG, so it's Scientific Working Group of SWIG. ANT is, SWIG-ANT is for forensic anthropology. SWIG dog is for scent detection dogs. SWIG gun is for firearms, and so on and so forth. So I was a participant in SWIG-ANT for a couple of years when I was president of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. Shall I go into OSAC at this point, then?
That was going to be my next question. So let me ask you a question.
Okay, sure.
OSAC being the Organization of Scientific Area Committee?
Yes.
Okay. What is OSAC, and what was your role with OSAC?
Okay.
Dr. Grant?
So when SWIG-ANT finished a lot of their documents, a lot of the guidelines and standards for forensic anthropology, in 2009, at about the time when they had finished a bunch of their documents, there was a study that came out, a book that came out that was published by the National Academy of Sciences called Strengthening Forensic Science, A Path Forward in the United States. That was in 2009, and it was scathing about a lot of the disciplines in forensic science, and most notably bite mark analysis, for example. So when somebody bites somebody else, then they create a mark, and dentists will look at that mark and try to match it to a person who was the biter. And this study, this book, addressed several of the forensic science disciplines and said that there's a lack of standardization in some of these disciplines. That it did not actually really address shortcomings in forensic anthropology, but some of the things that they said about some of these other disciplines really does reach over into forensic anthropology. So it's just subsequent to that, Congress got involved, and they decided that there needs to be an organization that helps address these issues, serious issues, and to help develop standards and guidelines, best practices in forensics. And so the Organization of Scientific Area Committees was organized and developed by Congress. That was in 2014. That was their first meeting, and I was invited to attend. I was made vice chairman of the anthropology subcommittee for that organization at that time. That continued until last year when I was made chairman. So I'm currently chairman of the forensic anthropology subcommittee of that organization.
Thank you, Dr. France. And what awards have you received in connection with some of the work you've been describing here?
Well, one was an award for service from OSAC. About 10 years ago, I was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award. Seems a little premature to me, but Lifetime Achievement Award for from the Physical Anthropology section of the American Academy of Forensic Science. That was pretty special. I've received some commendations from sheriff's offices and so on too. But.
Commendations from sheriff's offices in connection with your work on homicide investigation?
Yes. Well, yes, and also I do this service, and I think most forensic anthropologists do, where if law enforcement or medical examiners or even the public goes out and they find a bone and they don't know what it is, they can text me or email me a photograph of that bone, and I can tell them whether or not it's human, usually, unless it's really a small fragment. And so, for example, the Pueblo Sheriff's Department has sent me so many of these emails, and I don't charge anything for it. And so they send me these emails, and so I've done that so many times that they finally made me an honorary detective, which I thought was kind of fun. But yeah, basically those kinds of things. A lot of it is human, non-human identification.
Have you testified as an expert previously?
I have. I think this is my 26th time.
And have you testified as an expert for both the prosecution and the defense in various cases?
Yes, I have.
Your Honor, at this time, the people would move to have Dr. France qualified as an expert in the location and recovery of human remains, as well as an expert in forensic anthropology.
Mr. Bogan?
No objection to those, to that endorsement certification.
She'll be qualified as an expert in those areas, and you're going to move into something else, so it's probably a good time for a break, correct?
Sure, thank you.
Okay. It's almost 10 o'clock. Remember my admonitions not to talk to each other about the case, and we'll start up again at 10:15. Everybody rise for the jury, please. All right, we'll be in recess.
Thank you, Your Honor.